Against our wills, we are drawn in, whirled round, blinded, suffocated, and at the same time filled with a giddy rapture. Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Nicole, and today I am here to share with you the book I most recently finished and to just do a quick book review. So I only have one book to talk about this week. That's just kind of how the month of reading went, and also I spent a couple of weeks reading this book, and that book is Crime and Punishment. This is my first work that I have read by Dostoevsky, and I'm here to tell you about the book and mostly tell you about my reading experience. This will be a non-spoiler book review where I will just be going over in brief what the book is about and whether or not I would read it again and who I think would be most likely to enjoy reading this book, which may be you. All right, let me go ahead and get into it. So, Crime and Punishment. I read this book. It was the book club pick for April and May for my channel members book club. And yeah, this is a pretty gory cover, so sorry if that's disturbing you, but it fits the book. Let's just say that. So let me start by telling you a little bit about this book. I would classify this as a work of it's a mix of things. I would say it's a mix of satire, realism, naturalism, as well as a character study and a psychological study, though maybe not of what you're thinking, which would normally be the character or protagonist of the book himself. This book chronicles the rapid decline of a young, ruined man named Raskolnikov who wants to prove something to himself, the world, his family, the universe. I don't know. You decide. I couldn't quite decide myself. I would say mainly to himself. And so he decides to engage in a very questionable act, to say the least. And he's hoping to right the wrongs of the world, save humanity, become great. Again, to decide what he's trying to do, I would say you probably want to read and find out for yourself, because I definitely don't want to spoil those things for you. I think it's really interesting to discover what his motivation is, what his goals are, and how he decides to approach them, shall we say. Those are both major parts of this book. Anyway, the story starts out with Raskolnikov, who has been sitting in his room pondering some ideas, and at the very start he decides to go out and sort of test out his thoughts and whether or not he thinks he can achieve his goals by doing them. He very shortly thereafter decides to go ahead and proceed and give it a good old try. And from that point on, we follow his psychological conflict that he is involved in. It is mainly for him an internal conflict, but we also get to see quite a few subplots, in fact, following the difficulties that his friends are going through, his family is going through, and just what is going on in the society surround him and in the environment around him and how that is impacting his life. That is largely how the idea of naturalism comes into play here, where it's looking at not necessarily nature, as the name might seem to imply, but really looking at how the environment around the person, whether it is a natural one or a man-made one, is impacting the character and or reflecting their internal life. And his surroundings definitely are a reflection of his internal struggle and life and atmosphere in general, particularly his own room. And I mention that because those are things that you're definitely going to want to pay attention to while you're reading this book. So, what do I have to say about the ideas that are covered in this book and what you're intended to pick up? I guess I'll start by talking about the author's intent. So, like I said, this book, or maybe I didn't say that, is written by Fyodor Dostoevsky, who was basically a peer or contemporary around the same time as Tolstoy. So, if I talk about what this book is about, I think it's also important to add a little bit about what the author intended to discuss or to go over in writing this book. I think the first thing to consider is that he wrote this partially because he felt compelled to. At the time Dostoevsky wrote this book, he did need to make some money, and so he did come to an agreement with a publisher to serialize this work and to put it out into publication, or at least to write something. And this is what he decided to write on, and partially because he wanted to make an argument against somebody else he was in conversation with against the idea of nihilism. It was also intended to be a social commentary on what was going on in the world around him, and he wanted to sort of write in the style of naturalism and realism. He felt like it was very important to realistically portray the way people behaved in the world, because that was going to most accurately communicate to readers what his intent was in the book. And I will discuss how effective I thought that was and whether or not he actually wrote in that manner. This was definitely meant to be a sort of psychological portrait of the outcome of thinking in some of the new, more modern ways that were becoming popular in his society at that time. And he himself said that this was supposed to be a book that was studying and following the mind of crime. Not the mind of a criminal, the mind of crime, which I do think he did. But if you're expecting this to be the psychological study of a criminal, I don't think it's quite that. And hopefully I'll remember to talk about why I don't think it's that. It wasn't intended to be that. And I do think there are things that are missing in this book that prevents it from being a great character study. The audience of this book was intended to be sort of the intellectual community of Russians at that time. So not necessarily your most elite people, but certainly your educated class. And he goes over and examines a lot of areas surrounding the human condition and why we do the things that we do, particularly why crime happens and a little bit of why someone might commit a crime. But I think more than that, looking at the type of mindset you have to be a criminal. And in that, he is also looking at how we are weaker than we maybe think or want to be, how our actions have severe consequences at times, and how only God can save us from sort of all of the above, if you will. Now, I think the big question for me is, did I find these things successful? Did I find them true? Did I feel like it worked out? Did I enjoy this book? And I would say the parts of this book that I thought were the most successful was the way that he wrote the character in terms of communicating how Raskolnikov, our protagonist, how he felt after committing this crime. And I don't mean literally how the character felt, but I guess I mean more like psychologically how he was doing after committing this crime. I did not find that I got as much of the protagonist's interior thoughts and dialogue as I was expecting to. You do get some, but I don't feel like what we got was as revealing as I wanted it to be, and maybe as revealing as I personally needed it to be. That said, I do think he did a really good job of just getting you into that mind fog, confusing state of being that I feel like Raskolnikov was going through. Like, if you want to feel as crazed and confused as a criminal would that is like Raskolnikov, like, read this book. You're gonna feel like you have a fever. I mean, talk about this is probably the original fever dream type of book. It definitely had that feel going on throughout. Did I like it? I don't know, but I thought it did it well. Another part that I thought was successfully done in this book was talking about one of his main arguments about the type of person and the mindset a person might have who is just going to go out there and do whatever it is that they feel like needs to be done to be extraordinary and possibly criminal. So there is an argument in here, there is a discussion about this concept of extraordinary people or the extraordinary man, and I thought that argument was laid out really well and clearly. That doesn't mean I thought it was a convincing argument. I literally just mean it was discussed in a clear way that I felt like it was very easy to understand, like, what the conversation and dialogue and philosophy of this idea was. And I thought it was one that was really interesting to follow and think about. I don't know that I buy it as being true, but I did like the thought experiment. This book, however, fell short for me in a couple of places, most specifically having to do with the characters, the epilogue, and the overall reading experience. So with the characters, I feel like one of my biggest quibbles was with the dialogue. For it to be a book that is supposed to fall into realism and is moving less away from caricatures and more into how people really act. I felt like the dialogue was very stilted. My translation included a ton of ellipses. There was a lot of unfinished sentences. The ellipses themselves drove me crazy in this book. I get that people like pause and hesitate and don't complete their sentences, but the way it was done in this translation, I think just made it feel too broken. I looked at a couple of other translations while I was reading this book, and it really was this translation. Like just the way Oliver Ready is a translation of my edition, this particular edition, and just the way he did the dialogue, just I don't know, it really didn't work for me, which was disappointing because I did spend some time picking out which translation I wanted. And yeah, this just didn't do it for me. It made me hate all the conversation that happened and all the speeches that existed in this book. And there were a lot. So there were quite a few times that I was like, oh gosh, we're going to get another speech and we're going to get another 1,000 ellipses. Oh well, it was what it was. That said, I also felt like the way the characters and characterization was done, especially for Raskolnikov, kept me too distant from him. I don't know that I needed the book to be a first person. I think it was a choice to not have more first person perspective from Raskolnikov, but I felt like I just wasn't in his head enough. And some of that makes you have to wait to find out his motivation and his thought process on what's happening. So there was a little bit of surprise that came at the end with that. But I don't think that was a good enough payoff for me to just really feel like the entire book that I really just didn't understand him, didn't know where he was at, and was confused on top of all of that. It didn't make me understand him better as a character, and I felt like that should have been the point, and I don't feel like that was achieved. I mentioned not liking the epilogue. At the end of the day, it just felt way too like Deus Machina, like almost literally to me. And I get for Dostoevsky, that was the point. And I understand from a religious viewpoint what he was trying to say there. It was just a very disappointing end to a rather long book. I overall just found the book really hard to follow. I found Raskolnikov difficult to understand and follow. And there was a part of me that wanted to say, well, that's the point. But there's another part of me that felt like I didn't get anything out of that point, and that it just went on too long, and that there were 3,000 subplots that didn't seem like they needed to be in the book. I felt like this book was two books. One was about Raskolnikov and this crime and punishment, and the other one was almost like an Anna Karenina story about like marriage and family life. And I didn't feel like the connection between the two worked out as well as they could have. I definitely would have said I felt like the whole subplot with his sister and his mother and all their issues could have been left out, and it could have just been stuck with Raskolnikov and Sonia and her, or Sofa, or Sophia. I forget, I've called her too many things. Anyway, with her and her family and Raskolnikov, if the book had just stayed with those subplots, I would have been happier. But they didn't, and because of that, it just felt like there were too many points of view and perspectives and subplots that we were following, and that it just made the book longer, not better. So, what did I end up rating this book? 2.5 stars. It was a really low rating for me. It's not that it's a hard read. I would not say that. I just personally didn't find it an enjoyable read. And that's usually what a 2 means for me, is that I personally didn't enjoy it. I know there are a lot of people who really like this book and think it's really good. And I think if you like literary fiction, you're probably really going to like this book. I didn't find it as philosophical as I thought it was going to. I felt like it took a long time to get there. I felt like it was a lot more dramatic and a lot more of like a family drama in a weird way than I expected it to. And yeah, I was kind of disappointed. And I have to admit, given that it's a book club pick, I feel kind of bad that like other people had to read it for book club. That said, there were some memorable moments in this book for me. I did like this speech that was given about the extraordinary people and that whole idea. I think the final explanation of where he is at after 4 days was really interesting to hear and unpack and think about that in light of everything else that's happened in the book. And it did inspire me to want to read more where there were characters or some sort of discussion about these type of people, and people who have this like, I want to be an extraordinary person type of complex, but not Napoleon. I don't want to read about Napoleon because that's probably the most like obvious character who has this sort of idea or complex in their mind. And I do want to read more books about criminal minds and character studies and exploring their motives. Like, I think exploring the motives of sort of like a villain or a bad guy or that kind of thing is always an interesting topic. And then finally, I think I opened this video or some part at the beginning of this video with a quote from Virginia Woolf. And she had said about this book that against our wills, we are drawn in, whirled round, blinded and suffocated. I agree with all of that. That's my experience of this book to a T. Where I like verge off from Virginia Woolf is where she says, at the same time filled with giddy rapture. I was filled with something. I might have even been giddy, but it was not with rapture. So finally, I usually conclude with things that I would read more of, read alike, that kind of thing. Would I read Crime and Punishment again? Maybe. But if I did, it would have to be in a different translation. There's no way I could convince myself to read this exact translation again. I don't even want to reread the parts that I tabbed again. I would just maybe try rereading those parts in a different translation that I borrowed from the library and then decide if I actually wanted to buy a different translation of the book. But I'm also kind of doubting that. Would I read more? I thought maybe I would read Notes from the Underground next because I do have that. However, I did see somebody else's video where they were like, oh yeah, the writing style and the way he talks about things in here is exactly like Notes from the Underground. And I was like, never mind. So I might try The Idiot by Dostoevsky. I have heard from somebody else who seems to have very similar reading taste to mine that this is their least favorite Dostoevsky, and they find it very different from a lot of his other works. So I was thinking of trying The Idiot by him. It is another one of his shorter works, and I feel like I need to try something shorter by him to see if it's just his writing style that I don't like before I move on to some of his longer works. I do own Notes from the Underground, and I own, what is it? It's right behind me. The Possessed. And Brothers K, which again, I've been told is totally different. But I think I'll probably get The Idiot next. I don't know. So read alikes. What books do I think read like Crime and Punishment? Native Son for sure. There were a lot of like similarities, and that's intentional. Richard Wright, who wrote Native Son, was influenced and saw Dostoevsky as a mentor and did acknowledge that Crime and Punishment was a major influence on him in writing Native Son. I will say this, I liked Native Son way better and honestly would say it's a better book that covers the topics and discussions that I expected to be covered out of here. And especially in terms of being more the psychology of a criminal. So if that's what you're looking for, I would say don't read this, read Native Son instead. And then if you're just interested in the inspiration for Native Son, you could go back and read this. I also think that there are similarities between this book and the exploration of like a sort of villainous character, that kind of thing, to be found in Dead Souls. I think the same idea with Heart of Darkness, Picture of Dorian Gray, and Perfume. But I think, with the exception of Heart of Darkness, that all of those other books do it better. Two books that are on my TBR that I might check out because they're supposed to be similar or read-alikes would be Vicious by VE Schwaub, where I have heard of this book and I've read other books by VE Schwaub and I think they're okay. I never had any intentions of reading Vicious until I realized that part of the description of Vicious is that the two people in there kind of unintentionally making themselves into sort of villainous people because they're trying to be extraordinary. And it mentioned something about extraordinary people and extraordinary men. And I was like, oh my gosh, is this actually supposed to be sort of a modern update and idea of Crime and Punishment? Not directly, because it's very heavily influenced by like superhero kind of things or supervillains, but there's no way that idea of extraordinary people did not come from Dostoevsky. I was also interested in thinking about My Sister is a Serial Killer. There is a retelling of Crime and Punishment called A Curse on Dostoevsky. There is a nonfiction book that's on the true crime that inspired Dostoevsky to write Crime and Punishment, and that book is The Sinner and the Saint. And looking at this idea of like criminal minds, that kind of thing, there's American Psycho. I don't know if I could convince myself to read that, but you're definitely in the mind of an American Psycho. And then there's Chronicle of Death Foretold, which is following three men who decide that they can justify their committing of a crime. So there's some overlap in there. And then the final book that I have now on my TBR, thanks a lot to Crime and Punishment, is the Luzhin defense. Luzhin is a character in Crime and Punishment, and apparently in the Luzhin defense, it is following a guy who is in a chess match against another player, and he is a chess genius, at least according to himself, and he has decided that he is going to win this competition, but he suddenly finds himself in competition with another really challenging opponent. And if you have read Crime and Punishment, I think you could see where this idea of Luzhin being in a chess game and in a chess match would come from. And that book is written by Nabakov. Yes, as in the author of Lolita. So there's so many reasons that I am interested and curious about that book. So what am I going to read next? I don't know. Like I said, most likely it'll be The Idiot, but if I stuck with the books that I own, at this point it would probably be The Brothers K. But we'll see. Time will tell. Let me know if you have read Crime and Punishment and what your thoughts were on it, especially if you liked it. Do make sure to include why you liked it. Or if you disliked it and you disliked it for reasons I didn't even mention, comment that below as well. And that's it for me today. I hope you have been having a great reading week, and I'll talk to you next time.